I am Lee Kelso. This is Health Call Online, the place for extended versions of interviews you hear on our weekly radio broadcast, the Health Call Radio Hour. 1 in 5 Americans are taking some form of antidepressant drug. You know these drugs: Prozac, Celexa, Zoloft. Let me mention a couple more: Wellbutrin and Effexor. Those are 2 drugs that play an important role in the story that we're going to tell you today, written by Brooke, Siem, the author of a new book called May Cause Side Effects, her memoir of getting through this process, withdrawing from antidepressants. Brooke, it's a fascinating tale. I hope you're doing well today. Tell me how people feel when they're taking these antidepressants. How'd they make you feel?
For me, I think that there's a real narrative that people feel numb on these drugs and that they blunt emotional experiences. And that's certainly true, I think, to an extent. But I think for me, what I've realized now in coming off these drugs, how much I simply wasn't in my body. I simply wasn't home. I was so disconnected from everyone around me and from my own wants and needs. And so for me, that sense of disconnection really became critical. And I feel like sometimes we don't talk too much about that. We think it just numbs the edges, but I do think it actually makes us more disconnected from who we are, what we need in the community.
So you started taking these meds at age 15 after the death of your father, and were on them for 15 years thereafter. So you're about 30 years old. I read in your book that you were standing at your window thinking about how long it's going to take you to hit the ground. You were still thinking suicidal thoughts.
Mm-hmm.
And then what's the process? How did you decide now's the time to step off these drugs?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for me, like you said, I was standing at my window, my 30th story Manhattan window, staring down at the sidewalk and thinking about how long it would take to hit the ground. And what I realized that was not a thought that I should be having if the antidepressants were working. And that thought led to another thought, which was that I realized I had spent more than half my life and my entire adult life on these drugs, which meant that I didn't have a single unmedicated moment. And I started to question if my whole life was basically a lie, because I didn't know if I would have made the same choices had I not been put on these drugs when I was so young. So at the same time, I also got this opportunity to travel around the world for a year. And I realized that I had to take that opportunity to travel, and I couldn't do it while medicated. Literally, I could not take suitcases full of drugs with me to the places I was going. And also, emotionally, it was time for me to figure out my baseline. So I saw a psychiatrist, like we're all told to do. And that's actually really when things went quite south for me, was after I saw her, and she gave me some bad advice to stop one of my drugs cold turkey. And I was plunged into very serious antidepressant withdrawal very fast.
Yeah, so let's talk about that. You wrote that you had an intolerable sensitivity to light, sound, rage so strong I bent a metal ironing board in half, graphic homicidal visions. That's terrifying. And how long did that go on?
It was. I was in severe withdrawal for about a year. All of those symptoms that I listed there ebbed and flowed and would come in different intensities at different times, or sometimes all at once. The frustration is that at the time I was on the lowest dose of one of the drugs I was on. And so my psychiatrist said, I can't prescribe a lower dose for you, so you just have to stop cold turkey. And this was 2016, and the literature was very scant at the time. We're lucky to have a lot more now. But that advice meant that I had no way to gently, gradually taper off these drugs. And so when those drugs were so suddenly pulled out of my body, that's when, everything just went haywire, because these drugs affect your whole system. And so that's why I had these withdrawal effects. Hopefully today, and I hope what my book helps do, is inform practitioners and patients more about a slow taper, and that there are ways to taper down your drugs, even if you're on the lowest dose available in the market. And I wish I had had that advice at the time. And if I had, I probably wouldn't have had to write the book. But because I didn't, we now know what can happen. And I hope that this helps people recognize those signs and symptoms.
I just heard a Harvard psychiatrist actually, the other day say that only 10% of patients actually receive effective benefit from these meds. What have you
I believe
heard?
that was Irving Kirsch, and it's 15%.
15%.
Yeah,
Okay.
15.
So is that what you're hearing when you're talking to people? I'm sure folks who are going through the same thing have just come out of the woodwork with your book. What are you
Oh
hearing?
gosh, yes. I mean, anecdotally, that percentage seems to be right on track. I mean, I obviously, the people who come to me are in pain. They've had bad experiences, and so my view is probably a little skewed from that perspective. But if you have a group of 20 people in a room and you ask everyone, are you or someone on antidepressants? Everyone raises their hand, right? And then if you say, okay, are you or someone who's taking antidepressants also still depressed? The hands stay up. So we know now it's been roughly 50 years since antidepressants started coming onto the market, roughly 30 years since the late 80s, early 90s, when modern antidepressants like Prozac, et cetera, have been used. And during that time, all we're seeing is an increase in suicidal rates, an increase in disability because of mental health issues, and a culture that is clearly not doing well. So my perspective on the matter is if these drugs were working as advertised for the majority of people, we would not be worse off than we are now. Now, that's not to say that for a percentage of people, and as the research shows, it's roughly 15%, these drugs can be very helpful. Basically, clearly, we're not doing well with this strategy.
Yeah. Yeah, it seems that way. So, you're a pretty high performing individual. Not only have you now written
Thank you.
2 books, you won
Yes.
the Food Network cooking competition Chopped while you were going through all of this craziness. You
I
went
did.
on this
Yeah.
this year away working abroad.
Mhm.
That's Would you have been all of those things if it wasn't for these medications?
I mean, that's the $1,000,000 question, right? I often spend a lot of time thinking about how my life would have been different had I not been medicated when I was a kid. And I don't have the answer, and I never will. As far as being able to win Chopped while in withdrawal, people, once I became public about that, people have a lot of questions about how I was able to do that. And I think there are a couple of things at play. I mean, I was a ballet dancer for most of my life, so I'm used to basically turning off the pain and performing. It's pretty much what I do best. So there was that aspect of it. I also got a little lucky on that day in the sense that I was having a better day overall than the days surrounding it. And I also did a ton of work with my counselor about getting through the pressure and the anxiety of being on Chopped while I was in withdrawal. So it wasn't something that I just went into and totally winged it. I had done a ton of preparation, both practically for the event and then also just emotionally and psychologically. So I think we can't discount the effort that I put in order to make that happen. And as far as traveling, the thing about withdrawal is that, we hear a lot about the terrible parts of it because, by and large, it is a pretty terrible, awful experience that I wouldn't wish on anyone. But there was also a lot of beauty to it in the sense that I was finally getting to know myself after 15 years, and I was getting to know myself for the first time as an adult. So a great example of this is that I was a very creative child. I loved arts and crafts. I liked making things. I wasn't a particularly talented artist, but I really liked it. And then I was medicated, and all that creativity just kind of stopped. I mean, it was just completely blunted, and I didn't feel like I really had a creative urge for a decade and a half, to the point where I didn't think that's who I was. And then I start getting off these drugs, and even though all the symptoms were so excruciating, I also had this intense urge to paint. And so I went out and bought a bunch of watercolors and some paint, and my sleep habits had really changed in withdrawal. And so I was up late and I would just spend my evenings painting. And I was so struck by the fact that I had this curiosity and I was so drawn to color in a way that I never felt before. And for me, that was so empowering because I said, what else is in me that I don't even know exists, right? Like, all I want is to be surrounded by color. And, my whole apartment was like red and black and these really intense colors. And it started to feel not good to me because what I wanted to be around was pinks and purples and oranges. And maybe it sounds like a small thing, but for me, it was huge because it was questioning the framework through which I had built my entire life, what I like to do, how I like to feel. It was completely different. And withdrawal offered me glimpses into who I would become. And so while I was traveling, I was really experiencing that a lot. And by the time I was finally out of withdrawal, I was a completely different person. And I would not have been able to get there without having gone through this experience. So in retrospect, I'm actually quite grateful for it, even though it was terrible and avoidable.
Wow. So how you doing today? Any meds at all? Or are you just, how you just, no, nothing at all, huh?
No, I haven't taken a single prescription drug other than one 3-day course of antibiotics for a finger that got cut in the past 6 years.
Wow.
And so I feel extremely grateful for that. And yeah, I'm doing really well.
And no depression, no anxiety, none of that stuff?
Nothing that's not unreasonable, because I think the thing is life throws a lot of things at us that we are naturally supposed to feel anxious about, or things that we are supposed to be depressed about. For example, I just got out of a long-term relationship, and that has brought out very classic signs of depression, in the sense that I could go get a prescription if I wanted to tomorrow. But the reality is I just lost someone really important to me, and it was an important relationship. I'm supposed to grieve that. I'm supposed to, not feel perky all the time because of that. And I think it's so much healthier and so much better for me to actually experience these things. It honors the experience to go through this. So, I feel confident that I'm going to be able to manage this for the rest of my life, and just feel what I'm naturally supposed to feel.
That is very encouraging for people who are on the fence right now and unhappy with the med protocol they're on, and want to know about options. What do you tell them about the first step? You had a terrible experience talking to your psychiatrist about this.
Yes. Yeah. And that's really the first step, is you've got to get a team of people on board who support you and believe that you are whole and not broken. And I think that is the key thing, because if the people in your life, whether or not that's a spouse or a parent, or sibling, or your doctor, really believe that you're broken and that you are so screwed up that you don't have the ability to heal yourself, then you pretty much have no chance to actually heal yourself when you're getting that input. So the first thing is to get a team of people around you who want to support your healing journey and support potentially getting off of these drugs. The second thing is to make sure they're educated. This is a fairly new area of research, but we've gotten a ton of great research that's come out over the past 3-4 years on polypharmacy or tapering. There's something called hyperbolic tapering, which is a method of very slow controlled tapering that seems to generally be the best way to go for most people. So there needs to be a ton of research done to start. And that onus really needs to be on the individual to do that, because doctors are simply not able to manage all the new research and all the new information that's coming at them. I think that is a real thing that we need to recognize. I don't think that most doctors are out there to screw their patients up. They got into the field to help people, right? But the field has changed. The field is full of pressure and invoicing and managing insurance companies, which takes away time for doctors to actually become, further educated about the medications and whatnot that they are actually prescribing. So the patient needs to come to the table and say, we need to work together on this. And the doctors need to be receptive to that.
Yeah. Oh, sister, I'm telling you, a lot of doctors privately complain about just what you said, all that non-clinical help that they're called upon, and things to do that are just running the business of healthcare. Yeah, you are so right on that. So go back a second and just give me a few more bullet points on this hyperbolic. Tell me that a phrase again. It's a new one for me.
It's called hyperbolic tapering. I'm not a doctor. I'm not a researcher. So what I have learned about this has been through my own proactive education and talking with experts. But most of the research that's come out about hyperbolic tapering is based out of the UK. And it's a dose reduction method that ends up being in this hyperbolic curve, which means that you go down very slowly, and as you slowly break it down. So for example, let's say you're on 100 milligrams of something, then you would go down by 10%. So now you're at 90, and then the next cut would be 10% of 90. So now you're at 81 milligrams. And then from there you subtract 8.1 milligrams and go down. And then the math gets harder for me to do in my head. But the reason why this is challenging is one, the patient has to be very involved and, communicate with the doctor and make sure that everyone's stable before making the next cut. But also, as we mentioned earlier, you can't get custom prescriptions from these pharmaceutical companies.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So the way to do this, you very often need to work with a local compound pharmacy. Most cities do have them. And then for places that don't have compound pharmacies available, what happens is people end up actually dosing these drugs out themselves at home. And that can be a very risky thing to do if you don't know what you're doing. So that's why doctors really need to be working with their patients, and they need to, scour all the resources available to make sure you're not, for example, some drugs you can't cut in half because it breaks the chemical release chains, right?
Right.
Some drugs you can dissolve in water, some you can't. So, so you just have to know what you're doing, and that requires a huge amount of education, and it's not easy. But if it can help people, mitigate these symptoms, it can be worth it.
So somebody listening right now who's been on these meds or is currently on them, what's an indication that it's time for you to think about stepping off the meds? That's got to be a tough question for people.
In my experience, when people talk to me about this, they've already been thinking it, right? I mean, if there are people who are on these medications, these drugs, who are very happy on them, and they have no desire to get off them at all. The thought has never entered their mind. And for those people, I say, keep doing you. If that's you, go for it. Then there are a lot of people who they wonder, are these drugs blunting their emotional experience? Are they doing anything at all? Are they still depressed despite these drugs and they don't know what to do? And I think the trap that I fell into, that other people fall into, is you think, well, if I've spent however many years on antidepressants and I'm still depressed, how much more depressed will I be without these drugs?
Yeah.
But there's a lot more going on there, right? Like we have data that talks about that these drugs become less efficacious over time, that there's something called tardive dysphoria that basically just means persistent depression while on antidepressants, right? So I think if you're even just thinking about it at all, that's an indication that maybe it's time to start moving and towards a different choice.
So I go talk to my doctor about that, and he says, I'm not sure that's a good idea. That's what happened to you, right? Your doctor's
That's what happened to me.
I don't think that's a great idea.
That's when I say you got to find another doctor and get a second opinion, because you are in charge of your own health and you know yourself better than any doctor ever will. So if you feel like this isn't working for you, you have got to go find someone who is going to support you in what's best for you. Otherwise, it's just never, ever going to work. Like, I wish I had gotten a second opinion, but I didn't even think to at the time. I just assumed my doctor knew what she was talking about. She just didn't. She didn't know me.
Something that came to mind for me reading your memoir and your descriptions of visualizing violence and the desire to hurt people. That's really shocking. Can you describe some of that for me, what that was like?
Yeah. So these were what's called intrusive thoughts. I think everybody has them. It's just the degree to which we have them and what's being projected. So, it's a little hard to explain, but I think you know it when you feel it. It's almost kind of just like you're going about your day, and then an image flashes into your head that feels completely relevant and very scary. I think a good example that a lot of people are familiar with is if you're driving on the highway. I've heard a lot of people talk about this. I've experienced it before. You're driving on the highway at 65 miles an hour, and all of a sudden you just think, what if I just swerved my car right into the median or into oncoming traffic? Like, what would that be like? What would happen? That's a perfect example of an intrusive thought that I think is pretty accessible. So for me, what started to happen is if I was walking on the street, I would have that same kind of intrusive onslaught of like hurting the person who was coming at me, or hurting myself, or, an animal, or just these absolutely horrific things that were so scary because I thought that I actually must be crazy, that if I'm thinking about this, then I might do it. And that, God, that was so scary to think. And then I talked to a psychologist who's a friend of mine, and what she said to me, which really changed my whole outlook on it, was she said, crazy people don't know they're crazy. And she said, there's the fact that you have this self-awareness that you're having these thoughts and you're scared of them means that you're not actually going to act upon them, and that they are a function of withdrawal or a level of anxiety that's happening right now. So in the research I've done about intrusive thoughts, they're sometimes classified as kind of OCD-like things where it's basically your brain just showing you what could happen in any situation, and it's a lot to process. And I think that for me, when I just suddenly, was pulled off the effexor, my brain didn't know, literally just did not know what to do. And, there was very much a chemical imbalance that had been created once I was pulled off these drugs. And so what it felt like was my brain just showing me every possible option of what could happen in the world. And that includes some really deep, dark stuff. And, choosing to talk about it was one of the hardest choices I've made, because I'm like, oh God, what are people going to say? But the more you talk about it, the more people are like, oh yes, I think that, I experienced that. It's terrifying.
So when I read about those thoughts, it came to me, all these mass shootings that we see happening with frequency, and so many of these folks have been in the system and are medicated.
Yeah.
I know you don't have, we're speculating here, but is it reasonable to assume there's a connection to any of that? What do you think when you see one of those shootings? Do you think, oh, I'll bet he was on?
What I think when I hear about this stuff is that I wish there's a test called a CYP450 test, and it's used for cancer patients to measure how they can metabolize drugs, because a lot of people simply cannot metabolize. The people don't metabolize anything the same. So some people they cannot process some drugs through their system, and it's measured through this test that's called a CYP450 test. And this is a really extreme story, but I know someone who he took Zoloft, and he was not able to actually process Zoloft in his system. He didn't know that at the time. And he actually he went into a psychotic rage from what ended up being a toxic buildup of Zoloft, and murdered his son. And he ultimately was let off by a jury. This happened in Canada because he took the CYP450 test. They realized he actually had no ability to process this drug. He was, also in an obvious psychotic state. And so now he walks free. And, that makes a lot of people really uncomfortable. But I just think to myself, how much better would we be at prescribing and perhaps avoiding some of these, violent acts if we just tested whether or not people could process the drugs we're giving them? It just seems to me like a pretty obvious thing to do. I mean, there's so many preventative things that we could do, but we don't. So we have this technology. Why isn't it more common? I don't understand why we can't just do that. And instead it gets, it's becoming like a political football.
I'll pay some attention to that. That's interesting. I'll look into that a little bit further. So
I can give you some resources.
Please do email them over. Yeah. So what is your success for you after writing this book will be what? What changes after you've written this book that would really make you think this effort was so worthwhile?
I want the idea of antidepressant withdrawal to be as much of a household concept as the idea of going on antidepressants themselves. For me, this is a two-part conversation, right? If we're going to basically medicate the whole world, we need to be a lot better at pulling people off these drugs, taking them off safely. And more importantly, just if we're going to put them on there, it's got to be for temporary, short-term periods of time. And when the crisis is past, we get them off. Because what we're doing is not working. And there are far too many people suffering through withdrawal unnecessarily simply because there's a lack of education.
What's next for you?
I just am pretty glad to live a nice life and be happy and be able to manage and handle all the things that come at me. I do all this advocacy work around antidepressant withdrawal, and I speak as much as I can. I love speaking. I love teaching on the subject. And I also still work as a full-time chef. And I love that too, because, I get to have hard conversations and very often talk to a lot of people who are suffering because of withdrawal. And then I go downstairs and bake cookies for, a startup I'm working with. So it's a really nice balance to be able to do something as light and easy as like a cookie, which just brings everyone joy. And then also get to do this really hard work. So I just
great.
hope that all continues.
Well, I enjoyed your book. I hope others will explore and also then take a good look at may cause side effects. If someone in your life is using these medications, it's good to know what Brooke Siem went through and her advice on how to avoid that in your life. Brooke, thank you. Really enjoyed talking with you.
Thank you so much, Lee.